Cannibalism has been a popular theme in media for centuries. For example, the indigenous people in the Americas were portrayed as cannibals by the European settlers in their media and travel logs to convince governments to fund colonization efforts. And Sigmund Freud talked about cannibalism as a taboo that is pervasive among all human cultures. And so, since we have such an innate and instinctual dislike for the practice, examples of cannibalism, both real and in fiction, serve to explore themes of fairness and morality and push the boundaries of our ethical frameworks to their limits. In 1838, Edgar Allan Poe wrote a novel entitled The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, which follows the main character Pym in his adventures around the world and at sea and things like that. And so at one point in the story, Pym, along with a couple crewmates, decide to engage in a mutiny against the captain. And so they kill the rest of the crew, leaving only the three of them alive, plus one other young boy named Richard Parker to help run the ship. And eventually they hit storms and encounter trouble, and they decide that ultimately, in order to survive, they're going to have to resort to cannibalism. And so they draw straws, they cast lots to decide randomly who will be eaten. And the man, Richard Parker, ultimately draws the short straw, and they kill him and eat him, and ultimately the three men survive because they were able to engage in cannibalism. The actions of the men in the story were consistent with the moral framework of the time. See, it was generally understood during that time period that cannibalism was acceptable in cases of shipwreck where it becomes the only option for the survival of the group. As long as there is a fair lottery process, people were not prosecuted for engaging in cannibalism as a means of survival. So during this time period, the common moral understanding was that cannibalism was okay in cases of necessity, especially when the decision of who to eat is made fairly. About 50 years after the novel by Edgar Allan Poe, a real-life case of cannibalism shifted the public opinion on the custom of the sea. In this case, 4 men got shipwrecked and ultimately had to resort to cannibalism for survival. One of the men, coincidentally also named Richard Parker in this story, had drank some of the salty seawater and fallen ill as a result. So Dudley and Stephens, 2 of the other men, decided that they should kill him and eat him so that they might survive. The third man, Brooks, doesn't engage in the killing, but he does eat some of Richard Parker's remains. So he's not on trial for murder like Dudley and Stephens are, but he did engage in some cannibalism. This case effectively brought an end to the custom of the sea, as the men Dudley and Stephens were found guilty of murder. The court ruled that it is wrong to kill an innocent person under any circumstance, even if just to preserve one's own life. The 2 different legal handlings of cases of cannibalism are reflective of a larger debate in ethics between utilitarianism and deontology. The custom of the sea ascribes to a more consequentialist utilitarian ethic, by trying to create the most good and the least bad in these survival scenarios. Surely it would be better to have 3 people survive and 1 person die compared to all 4 men dying of starvation. Now, some people might look at cases of cannibalism and take them as evidence against utilitarianism. Some people might see murdering an innocent person and eating them as a terribly wrong act that could never be justified even by one's own survival. And this is reminiscent of a common case that's leveraged against utilitarianism of the 5 organ recipients and the healthy patient, where imagine if one healthy patient goes into the doctor's office for a cold or a physical or a checkup of some kind, and while he's there, there are 5 other patients who are about to die unless they receive some vital organ. By killing the healthy man, we could distribute his organs to the 5 in need, and all 5 of them could live at the expense of this one person's life. But we would intuitively say that this is a morally wrong thing to do, and you can't violate this one person's right to life just to preserve the lives of others. But others will look at cases of cannibalism and agree that, it's unfortunate that someone has to die in this scenario, but surely it's got to be better to kill the one person so that the others can survive. And this scenario would create the most net good and reduce the total harm, given that 3 men survive versus 0 of the men. The ruling in The Queen versus Dudley and Stephens is more reflective of a deontological or a more rule-based approach to ethics, where you could have a maxim like killing an innocent person is wrong, and that's a moral rule that you live by. Even in cases where following this moral rule would kill you, it's the right thing to do. These two cases contrast in their approach to fairness as well as morality. In the fictional case, we see that the men cast lots randomly to determine who will be killed and eaten, whereas in the historical case of The Queen versus Dudley and Stephens, the men single out the weakest member of the party to kill and eat. But which of these approaches is really more fair? Should the worse off really receive this additional burden of having to sacrifice their life to the others just because they happen to be in worse health? In our daily lives, it seems clearly unfair that the worst off receive some sort of additional burden beyond those required of everybody, but in survival scenarios in these really intense circumstances, maybe our typical moral frameworks aren't as applicable. No matter your opinions, cases like these, both fictional and historical, provide an opportunity to reflect on difficult philosophical questions and allow for a deeper examination of one's own personal beliefs. So how should we treat cases of cannibalism for survival? And how does that moral judgment impact the rest of our moral decisions as well?